In this video, we're going to take what we've learned about imaginary numbers and use that to simplify square roots of negative numbers. Alright, so let's just do a quick recap about square roots. Right? So let's think about this. What's the square of 25? Right? And that should be super obvious. That is equal to 5. Right? But let's make sure we know why. Why is that true? Well, square root of 25 is 5 because 5 times 5 is 25. Now let's think about the square root of negative 25. Right, what would that be? Right, now some people think that the square root of negative 25 is equal to negative 5. Now let's think about that. Does that make sense? Right, and the answer is no, that doesn't make sense because negative 5 times negative 5 is equal to positive 25, not negative 25. Right? So this is wrong. The square root of negative 25 is not equal to negative 5. Right? And so this problem here, the square root of negative 25, does not have a real answer, right? In the terms of real numbers, right? It doesn't have an answer that we're used to, right? And this is why in the video you guys watched the other day, we need the imaginary number, right? We talked about the square root of negative 1. The square root of negative 1 is not 1 because 1 times 1 is not negative 1. And it's not negative 1, because negative 1 times negative 1 is not negative 1, right? This we define as I, right? This square root of negative 1 cannot be simplified just using regular real numbers, right? This is what we call an imaginary number, right? So similarly, the square root of negative 25, this also is going to be an imaginary number, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use a factor tree to figure this out. Right? So let's think about negative 25. What numbers multiply to get negative 25? Well, I would start by doing negative 1 times 25, and then 25 is 5 times 5. Right? How does that help me? All right, let's see. So in other words, we can factor the square root of negative 25 as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 5. Right? Well, let's see here. What is the square root of negative 1? Right? This is not a real number. This is the imaginary number. That is I. And then what about this? The square root of 5 times the square root of 5. Well, by definition, that's equal to 5. So we get I times 5, or in other words, 5I. Right, let's pause and think about, does that make sense? The square root of negative 25 is equal to 5I. Well, if that's true, well then that would mean that 5I times 5I is equal to negative 25. Let's check to see if that's true. Right? Let's see what 5I times 5I is. Right? Well, 5I times 5I, that's the same thing as 5 times 5 times I. Right? And 5 times 5 is 25. Let's think about what I times I is. Right? That's I squared, or let's show all the steps here. That's the same thing as saying the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. Right? And so I squared is negative 1. So 25 times negative 1, that's negative 25. So yes, that is correct. The square root of negative 25 is not negative 5, it's not 5, it's an imaginary number called 5I. Right, I want you to do this one. So please go ahead and pause and simplify the square root of negative 16. Even if you think you already know what the answer is, I want you to show your work so that you really reinforce why this makes sense. All right, go ahead and do that. All right, let's check to see what you got. So I would first factor this as negative 1 times 16. And 16, we can factor that as 4 times 4. And 4 is 2 times 2. This is 2 times 2 as well. So basically, what we've said is that the square root of negative 16 is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. And then let's simplify this some more. What's the square root of negative 1? Well, that, by definition, is I. Right? And then right here, the square root of 2 times the square root of 2, by definition, that is 2. Right? And then again, radical 2 times radical 2, by definition, that is 2. So we get I times 2 times 2. Or we can simplify that to be 4I. Okay, that is our answer. The square root of negative 16 is 4i. Right, and just to double check, let me prove this to you one last time. All right, so if the square root of negative 16 really is 4i, well, that must mean that 4i times 4i needs to get us back to negative 16. Let's see if that's true. Right? Well, this is the same thing as saying 4i times 4i is 16i squared. Right? Or if I want to show the steps, right? 16 times I squared is I times I, or the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. Right? And negative 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. Or I'm sorry, the square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 is negative 1. So 16 times negative 1 is negative 16. Okay? All right, so you need, and in the future, if you want to check this, you really need to know this fact right here. Right? I squared, you should recognize that. Right? I squared, you need to have that kind of memorized as negative 1. All right, let's do another one. All right, the square root of negative 24. Okay, so I'm going to do this one, and then you'll try the next one out. So I would, again, factor this. So this would be factored as negative 1 times 24. And then this 24, I could factor that as 4 times 6. 4 is 2 times 2. 6 is 2 times 3, right? Doing the prime factorization. So what we've shown is that the square root of negative 24 is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 3. Okay? Square root of negative 1, that is I. Right here, square root of 2 times square root of 2, that is 2. Right? And then, let's see, to simplify the square root of 2 times square root of 3, this is square root of 6. So we have I times 2 times radical 6. Right? The way that we're going to write our final answer is going to be in this format. 2 times I times radical 6. Right? 2 times I times radical 6. All right, you go ahead and try this one. The square root of negative 50. Pause it and do it yourself, please. All right, let's check. So if we factor this, this is the same thing as negative 1 times 50. 50 is, let's see, 25 times 2. 25 is 5 times 5. So what we've shown here is that the square root of negative 50 is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 2. Right? Again, the square root of negative 1, this is I. And then square root of 5 times square root of 5, that is 5. So we have I times 5 times square root of 2. The format that we want you to write this answer is like this. 5I radical 2. All right. I want you to do some more practice here. So simplify the square root of negative 72, the square root of negative 49, and the square root of negative 14. Go ahead and pause and try these 3 out. All right, let's see if you got them. So I'm just going to run through these real fast. Right? So check your work. So this is, if we factor this, this is negative 1 times 72. 72 is 9 times 8. This is 3 times 3. This is 4 times 2. This is 2 times 2. So we have shown that the square root of negative 72 is the same thing as square root of negative 1 times square root of 3 times square root of 3 times square root of 2 times square root of 2 times square root of 2. This right here is I. And then the square root of 3 times square root of 3, that is 3. Square root of 2 times square root of 2, that is 2. And then I have a leftover radical 2. So the answer should be 6 times I times radical 2. Okay. All right, number 7. This one, if I factored it, it's negative 1 times 49, and this is 7 times 7. So this is the same thing as the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 7 times the square root of 7. And the square root of negative 1, we call that I. And radical 7 times radical 7 is 7. So I times 7, or 7i. And the last one, 8 here. If I were to factor this, this is the same thing as negative 1 times 14. 14 is 2 times 7. So we could represent this like this. The square root of negative 1 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 7. Right? Now the only thing we can simplify here is really this one. The square root of negative 1, again, we know that, is I. Right? Square root of 2 times square root of 7, nothing, there's no perfect squares there. Right? So this is just going to end up being the square root of 14. So your answer is just that, I times the square root of 14. Okay, lastly, there's just some things I want you to be aware of. I'm just going to run through these last two real fast. Okay, so I want you to think about whether these would be real answers or imaginary answers. Okay, just pause for a second, just think about that. Would these be real or imaginary? And the answer is that for number 9, this one, we're going to get a real answer on this one. And on 10, this one we're going to get an imaginary answer. Right? Think about why that's true. We have, number 9 is saying the opposite of the square root of 8. Right? The square root of 8, that's going to be a real number. Right? And we're just taking the opposite of that. Number 10, this is where we have a negative inside the square root. This is going to be an imaginary number. Right? Because we can't take the square root of a negative number with real numbers only. Okay? All right, so let's see what this means. All right, if I were to factor radical 8, that's 2 times 4, this is 2 times 2. So here's what we have. We would have the opposite of the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 times the square root of 2. Right? And right here, radical 2 times radical 2 is 2. So this is 2 times the square root of 2, and then I'm taking the opposite of the whole thing. So that's my answer. Negative 2 radical 2. This is a negative number. It's not an imaginary number. Okay? All right, 10. Let's see what this one would be. Let's factor negative 250. So I would factor this as negative 1 times 250. 250 is 25 times 10. This 25 is 5 times 5. 10 is 5 times 2. So let's see what we have. If we were to rewrite this out, it's the opposite of the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 times the square root of 2. Okay, and let's see what we can do here. The square root of negative 1, that is I. And then see, square root of 5 times square root of 5, that's 5. Square root of 5 times square root of 2, that's just radical 10. Right? And let's bring down the negative symbol here. So we're saying the opposite of I times 5 times radical 10. Right? And we can write this as the opposite of 5i radical 10, or negative 5i radical 10.